Hello there, my name's Card. Here on my YouTube page, I've made a fair few videos about a broad topic of particular interest to me: how social beliefs play out in people's real-world, day-to-day lives. Usually, whether I'm delivering facts or my own opinions, I try to speak plainly and directly about whatever it is I want to discuss. But in this video, I want to broach a topic that's quite a bit different to what I usually talk about, and it's one that I personally have not been able to find my final opinion on yet, despite having given it plenty of thought and looked into the discourse surrounding it. That is, the concept of identifying with a race that most observers would not consider your own. For the sake of a lack of any better terminology, I'll be referring to this from here on out as transracialism and being transracial. Like most people, my first instinct was to immediately say that it's not a thing, and that anyone claiming it is, especially if they themselves claim to be transracial, is most likely lying to you and probably themselves. But I do want to explore all the best possible arguments suggesting otherwise. Consider this video me essentially playing devil's advocate with myself out loud. So it most likely won't be as long or as structured as my videos normally are, but I think it'll be worth making all the same. I also want to give a disclaimer here that I'm not ready to say which way I think one way or the other yet. And I would really like to hear from people who might end up listening to this and who do feel strongly for either side of the debate already. So feel free to use the comment section productively after listening to this video. The way I see it, what we're talking about here is whether or not it would theoretically be valid that someone express a desire to be perceived as, and self-identify as, another race. I don't want to get into the weeds with how things like the idea of race, and how we attach discrete identities to skin tone itself, is a social construct, because we all know what I mean here. The most well-known example of this is someone like, of course, Rachel Dolezal. Just in case you don't know the story, Rachel Dolezal was a college educator and vocal NAACP activist who, her whole career, claimed to be, and convincingly presented as, a mixed-race black woman. Then, in 2015, she comes to international attention when a chance look into her background by a local media organization turns up the fact that she's completely, ethnically just a regular white American. Both of her biological parents are white, her siblings are white, and she was raised in the same basic Western European American culture almost any other white middle-class Gen X American was. But, even after what we might call her fraud was revealed, she continued to identify as a black person. Dolezal isn't the only person who's ever made this sort of claim, but it is exceedingly rare. It just so happened that this particular example got significantly more attention than the few other times it's ever made the news. And it came to light around about the same time that transgender issues were also starting to come to mainstream attention and getting thought about by a lot of people for the first time. I do think it's worthwhile bringing up that comparison to the transgender movement too, and I would like to reiterate what I believe in regards to transgenderism and have argued for on this YouTube page before. That I do believe in the validity of both binary and non-binary trans identities and reject trans-medicalist gatekeeping in favor of broad, good-faith acceptance of what gender people self-ID as. So, denying the possibility of a hypothetical transracial identity just on strict biological essentialist lines doesn't sit right with me. If we use the argument that allowing people to change their gender presentation physically, socially, and legally is necessary because of gender dysphoria being a real diagnosable condition that can be remedied through transition as a medical process, and then use that as the basis for why you can change gender, but seemingly not race, then I can't believe that either. Firstly, again in line with my thoughts about self-ID, I don't believe a diagnosis of, or even the occurrence of, dysphoria of any kind is essential to someone's claiming a transgender identity. And second of all, hard as these sorts of things can be to define or quantify, I think racial dysphoria could exist both physically and socially. It's an oft-reported experience of many lighter-skinned people of mixed African descent in the US and elsewhere, for example, that they are regularly ostracized to some extent by their darker-skinned peers for being less black. The obverse is also true, where darker persons of color report social discrimination from the lighter members of their community. That's called colorism, and long story short, it's a byproduct of humanity's long history of explicit racial bigotry. And it's not like it would be impossible for someone to internalize those sorts of prejudices to the point where they might start to irrationally dislike something like the very color of their skin, or people's perception of it. If we hold transitioning race to the same standard as transitioning gender, I don't think having that sort of dysphoria would be necessary. But if you do want to make the case it would be, then I'd still argue that racial dysphoria could exist. In a case like this, if someone wants to alter the color of their skin or the texture of their hair, or some other signifiers of ethnicity to assuage their appearance-related anxiety, then I don't really see any harm in that. And I don't think that anyone is going to undergo those sorts of procedures, even if they were more normalized, if they didn't feel a deeply held need to do so. There's a turf anti-transgender talking point that essentially argues that trans women are actually predatory men trying to infiltrate femininity. But that's nonsense. Trans people aren't trying to take over cis people's spaces. In much the same way, I don't think anyone is trying to infiltrate a cultural identity for no reason. I don't have a horse in this race either way, since I'm perfectly happy as being perceived as the race I already get perceived as by anyone who looks at me. But on the whole, I'd rather err on the side of progressive caution and try not to gatekeep labels. And I generally don't think purity testing is the way to go, especially not with something as immensely varied and inherently personal as someone's identity. Our modern conception of race may be as essentially made up as our 20th century holdover conception of binary gender identities, but that doesn't mean we don't still use racial categories as easy descriptive shorthand, or that one's ethnic and cultural background won't have an effect on your conception of self. Obviously, anyone who has two parents of fully African ancestry would be black, and most people would agree that someone with, for example, one black parent and one white, who identifies as black, is black. The most visible example would be someone like America's first black president, Barack Obama, whose mother was white. And in fact, the overwhelming majority of black people in the West have at least some prominent non-black ancestry. And I don't think it's all that productive to try and find where the exact line you can claim a POC identity is. Is someone with just one black grandparent black? What about one great-grandparent? Would the answer change in either case, depending on the exact shade their skin happens to be? It's like arguing how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. An interesting conversation for a while, but it doesn't actually serve a purpose. In that Rachel Dolezal case, the fact that she got away with claiming a black identity based solely on her appearance for so long proves that she passed as black to anyone who saw her, and therefore she would have been affected by all the same microaggressions and prejudices that conservatives seem too scared to acknowledge exist too. In an ideal world, no one would feel any internalized prejudice or negativity about their appearance. But until that's the case in reality, we might as well let people look how they want, as far as I see it. When it comes to someone like Dolezal, no matter what you think of her darkening her complexion, it's not like you could ever make it illegal to tan heavily or curl your hair. And supposing someone with naturally darker skin wanted to lighten it or straighten out their hair more, or even do something like put in blue or green contact lenses, that's fine too. Legally even, the government doesn't mandate racial identity markers or anything like that on your IDs either. And if you get a census or something asking you your ethnicity, there's nothing stopping you from ticking whatever box you want. If this ever becomes a big topic of debate within the cultural discourse again, I think the question isn't going to be framed as, is transracialism valid, as much as it would be, should transracialism be valid? And if that's the case, I think it would be up to the people championing each side of the argument to decide for themselves how they want to frame the question of cultural identity in the public eye. and things could go anywhere from there. People who, like myself, argue for the validity of non-binary gender identities point out correctly that non-man, non-woman third gender roles have existed across all sorts of societies for millennia, but being non-binary in the modern Western sense was more or less invented in 2014. That doesn't invalidate it, of course, I would maintain, but it goes to show that a concept that would have gotten you laughed out of the room among even the most progressive company in the world not 30 years ago is not only going all but mainstream with the generation that's coming of age currently, it's now even the position of a majority of self-described leftists to affirm the existence of transgender and non-binary persons. My favorite political news item in recent years was when, during the 2020 US presidential campaign, Joe Biden, who is an 80-year-old lifelong Catholic, said there were, quote, at least 3 genders at the Iowa State Fair. Just think about how far we've managed to come on gender issues that quickly. Although, for what it's worth, I would also hope we'd still recognize and protect transgender identities even if they were only being claimed by a handful of people on Earth, as transracial identities are claimed seriously today. I have no reason to think it necessarily would, but I have no reason to see why transracialism couldn't just be a normal thing by, say, the year 2050. If enough people ever believe in it, it would be up for public discussion in earnest. And once that happens, who knows if it'll take off. Plus, with a general increase in non-white persons as a percentage of most Western countries' populations projected to come about within the next few generations, I could see a lot of the subsequent increase in the number of mixed ethnicity people there will be around to throw up questions about what race means in practice in our lifetimes. For what it's worth, I don't consciously treat people any different based on their race. So if someone wants an identity conspicuously different from their skin tone, I don't think it really matters to me. In real-world terms, I don't ever see anyone in real life claiming to be transracial either, and frankly neither do you. I can't say I've worked out a perfect position for myself on the matter, but I don't think it's that important if it's a discussion we're not yet having. I'm not going to be leading the fight to make transracialism a widespread thing, nor am I going to work myself into a frenzy denouncing it. Thank you for listening to my little rambling back and forth on the matter. Like I mentioned towards the beginning of the video, I'd like to read what other people have to say on the matter, so if you've got something to add, please do comment down below. Until next time, thank you for listening, and have a lovely day.